All right, this is to Hythloday about why I think the hard problem is distinct and needs to be solved and addressed by physics and whatnot. But first, on the video that this is a reply to, the video it replied to, in other words, my video, that this video I'm replying to replied to. It's interesting, ironic that's the video that was non-offensive. I guess, I made all the same kind of points and I watched it and see, well, there was some jabs and stuff, but they didn't have names associated. Some people like that. I feel better when someone mentions the name, see? And I know if it was specific or not, and some people feel better if it's just left general and they can help choose themselves in their interpretation whether it applies to them. And that can be a good way, and this is an example of it because it seems like, as Hythloday, you picked and chose what you thought really applied to you, and I think there were in-between ones that you thought, well, maybe this applies to me, but whatever, I wasn't confused about that. I understood that from the beginning, so you choose to say, well, it doesn't apply to me. He's talking about the person that didn't understand. But you're close enough to it to think, yeah, somebody might have misunderstood that. So I went a little over the top and was sarcastic. I thought people kind of missed it with the yet. I thought it was implicit in my video. On the other hand, I'm totally willing to remember to go yet when that's the issue. I do take liberties probably with my verb tense and sense of time sometimes when maybe it's important. That would be good to think about. So I'm okay with that. So I'm glad that it worked that way. I'm surprised and mildly entertained that it did. So the hard problem, first of all, I'd really like you to understand my video on this distinction between the senses of self. We're kind of arguing over whether, where the issues are, they're on this first-person sense of self. And so let me go through it a couple different ways. I am trying to answer your question, but let's set up some framework and things we agree on. We agree that physics applies to everything, might even be trivially true, so we don't really have to debate that anymore, right? So the question is, to me it's this way, it's like, are we filling in the blanks or we need a new framework is kind of the question. So that's what the easy and hard distinctions are for consciousness. So for example, let's just take from computational AI three kinds of technologies and algorithms and approaches that prove to be really, really interesting. Neural networks, genetic algorithms, and case-based reasoning. I can imagine with just faster computers and more refinement and optimizations and practice and time to implement those three kinds of ideas, that you could simulate something that'll pass the Turing test. Like you could have a computer AI on your phone that'll talk to you, and if it was pretending to make a phone call to you, it might be hard to tell the difference past the Turing test, right? That's the so-called easy problem, and that's what everybody's working on because people feel that it's doable, and that's within our current framework, in that case a computational framework. We can create the behavior, something behaving like a self. And depending on how it's trained, you might even say, yes, I feel like I'm myself. Okay, but the so-called hard problem is this other thing, is that, okay, so I can imagine that the computer has images and the data goes into its processing, it's all processed, and it's really electrons flowing through circuits, and the circuits are switching. It's kind of like energy flowing through gears and whatnot. Or you can look at it just computationally, that there's conditionals and ands and ors and nots in it. And it takes that data and spits out a result, another data structure. And then it spits out another and processes those data structures. Eventually, with this kind of programming, it gets to, okay, here's what I know I'm going to do with the body, and it sets up data structures that then cause the body to move and react to it. But the question is, where in there, so it has data structures that represent itself. For example, where are its limbs positioned? It has a self-image in that sense. But at what point does it come on this Cartesian theater like we have it, where we feel like we're an observer? Look, my sense system, my field of view is about this big. Okay, there's a sort of a darkish rim as it gets a little bit dim in a dark sense at the edge. Then after back here, it's it's like a weird void, right? Because it's not dark, I mean, I'm in a lit room. I imagine it's light back there, but I don't see the light. But there's like imaginary light holding the place of the light I would see if I turn around. And since I have the camera pointed, I can actually, looking at the camera, I can see my hands behind my head and know they're back there. And all of this kind of visualization back here goes on, and it shows me that, okay, I'm collecting data from a field of view. I know that I'm collecting that. Or with the touch sense, you can have somebody prick you with a small stick, not too pointy, on your back, and there's some places you won't feel it and some places you will. Or if they draw a letter on the back, it might be hard, it's low resolution. There aren't as many touch sensors on your back as compared to, say, your finger. If somebody does that on your finger, even with your eyes closed, you'll feel it every time. You can tell shapes better because there's a finer grain mesh of sensors. This shows me that I'm only collecting what the sensors are showing me. Now, in the easy problem, a computer could be visualized as collecting all that kind of information and processing it and getting behavior similar to mine. But where in that processing is there a mechanism for something to be going, ooh, I'm watching this stuff. I'm thinking about it. I could see why such a thing would be useful to help, the thinking machine to process this information. But I don't see how it would arise. And so, unlike the easy problem where we could say, look, we've got these 3 algorithms, just keep perfecting them, we'll create something that acts like it has a self. We don't have the framework in experiencing being a self. We don't have a framework that we can fill in for that. We need, now, maybe it's there. I mean, like, I would admit, it's possible that the computational stuff, we'll create one of those and it'll say that it has a sense of self, and I'll be the old curmudgeon go, no, I don't think it's a real sense of self. It's just programmed to say that in some sense, right? But why would I make that distinction? Well, it's because of this. I have this subjective experience that doesn't seem simulated by simulating a third person self, that a robot that simply behaves more like us, that mimics us in its behavior, not in its internal workings. Okay, so I see that difference. Now, why do I grant to you, though, a similarity? Well, it's because through all the evidence, we all have the same genetic programming, and I kind of think the mechanism, since I think there's a physical mechanism, I'm not looking for a God to say, I like your kind of thing, and I'll put it in you. I could put the spirit in the robot. None of us believe that. I mean, among you and me and Joe and stuff, right? Obviously. So I mean, it's going to be material. So I'm looking at what kind of machine creates this, and I'm going, well, the DNA created me, and it creates everybody else, and they say that they have this experience. Unlike a robot saying it, I have a similar construction. So it's easier for me to grant that. But my whole point of having a solipsistic epistemology is to admit that there's some speculation to that granting. Maybe I'm the only one that has it, and that's why we come back to feeling the first person sense of self and realizing that my sense of self, life, my experience as I experience it, is different from watching somebody else acting, and it's distinct, and simulating that other thing isn't the same as simulating or creating one of these experiences like mine that I happen to think every baby is an example of, right? Every baby is a creation of one of these experiences from new. So to me, reductionist a little bit, physically, it's like, obviously can be reproduced, seems to be produced from the DNA. So I grant that the DNA is reproducing it, because it produced it in me, it's producing these others. I could see that the logic, material logic, tracing through the physics and the matter and the mass and all the electrical energy and any other science that is physically sound, right? So I can see that leading to the similarity between you and me, so when you say. Whereas as a programmer, I don't see how an actual sense of self sparks up when I imagine writing an AI with some clever databases and different kinds of reasoning that could behave, wow, it behaves just like a human. People think they can make friends with it. It has all of the people want to grant it a sense of internal self. But as the programmer, I'm like, well, where does that come? Sure, it's got data structures that represent itself, but surely every program has that, and that doesn't create consciousness. So where, at the very least, if somehow that's supposed to become the first-person view, where's the threshold? Or another way of putting it, you're saying it's just wiring, then I don't see how the wiring could do it. So maybe we could speculate which kind of wiring, is it when things are plugged in certain feedback loops, or what is because I don't see how any of that sparks up an internal thing. All of computer logic is like machine in the third person that happens to be myself do this thing. I don't see how that becomes, I am myself thinking that I'm doing things. You know what I mean? So perhaps you don't know what I mean there, but I mean but to rephrase what I mean, and try to just think about that last video and how certain kinds of over explicit stuff was actually helpful, I guess, to me. Over explicit, not necessarily really over explicit. It's very important, just to reiterate, this first and third person view of self. And the easy hard problem is sort of us agreeing that, well, this easy problem is where we can imagine filling in the blanks and getting the behavior. But how do we get the feelings of being the thing behaving? So, and I think third person versus first person is pretty good. Like, think of novels written in third or first person and the kinds of ways you deal with emotions in those cases. There's a distinction between these kinds of self, between someone writing, here's what happened to me, and someone writing, here's what happened to someone else, right? And yet it's subtle because we think of it as the same, and we sort of can do the mathematics or the logic to say, for you to imagine being in my shoes, for example. And so you can ignore that, but there's a reason a novelist uses one voice or the other, or it's really weird to use second person. And so, there's some, that's just a literary example of how the distinction, I try to convince you this distinction has some weight, because this conversation for me has to be had with reference to that distinction. Even if you want to go, well, it's not a real distinction, only this part of the distinction is real and the other one's false, or there shouldn't be a distinction because they're both the same thing, that's an argument I might come up with. And but still with reference to this, because that is an underpinning of why I look at things this way. You've been saying some things and I keep going to myself, well, he's talking about third person view of self. He's saying there's no hard problem because he's looking just at third, and third's the only question. But it's like, there is this question of first person self. Now, the other short extra reason of why I think it's ready is because I always thought you couldn't necessarily, that it was so abstract, like even compared to love, which is hard to look at through physics, but you can find out about pheromones and certain aspects, but then people could argue they relate to love, but they aren't love itself. So love's an example of a hard one, and consciousness is like, it probably can't be answered. But then I was thinking about, as I looked into quantum biology and stuff, how there's some speculation of, well, maybe it's because of self-collapse in quantum mechanics. Like, well, I don't know, but at least as falsifiable things, it's at least as good a candidate as string theory or anything else that's waited decades to even start to have falsifiable assertions. So that's okay. But then what I liked about that is, with Hameroff starting it, is that he's an anesthesiologist. And I think even if their theory doesn't go anywhere in the long run, always possible, right? I've seen great theories. I think ether's a great theory. Of course, didn't make it. But even if it doesn't go, I love in the long run, doesn't go anywhere, I like this kind of collaboration between a physicist, a mathematical physicist, and an anesthesiologist, medical, researcher, where Hameroff is not a physicist, but he refers and keeps up with physics literature in neurobiology, because it's important to his research. So he is using physics, and of course Penrose is using, especially through his mathematical and logical influence, something besides physics, not medical knowledge, but something also that's complementary. And then, so I like that kind of approach, and especially since it's not just the kind of person, anesthesiology, like, I have a huge respect necessarily for that field. Actually, I do, but for various reasons. But in this particular research, I'm just like, well, that's a really good, it's physical in the way that physics doesn't often deal with directly yet. It's physical in the biology, it's physical in that it matters to people, and there's reasons we have anesthesia besides obviously research. I mean, most of the reason is a practical reason, so people can mitigate their pain, but it's because it's so important in that sense. I think it's really interesting and useful to use that as a way of studying consciousness. So I think it already has begun, because of course people have been studying the chemistry of anesthesia for a long time. They've got a lot of answers, a lot of heuristics, there's a lot of good interesting leads and scientific leads there, but they still don't really quite have a handle on it. So to me, that's great. That's where It's not, again, like calling the thing the easy problem. It's not that easy. It's not that low hanging. But those are the current low hanging fruits. Those are the steps to take. Let's find out more and more about that. And I think we'll zero in on getting a handle on the physical nature of this phenomena. Because in science, I think the main thing is once you can identify it, things like anesthesia turns this off. We can look for 40 hertz in the brain and see if there's consciousness, or at least the potential for it, because it requires this or that or the other. As you do that, you start to identify the sphere, and once you do that, you can test it in all kinds of clever ways like scientists do, and start to maybe crack open why there is the first person view. So to be clear, my point is, with anesthesiology, you can look at it scientifically in the third person, because science is good at that, and also start to get a hint of where maybe the first person thing comes from. Okay, there is also the problem that even if we solved it and created an artificial life form, would we want to trust its report of its own experiences any more than the robot? I don't know. I think at that point we're back to, why do I grant you agency, so-called? Why do I believe you're a first-person experiencer and stuff? It's kind of, there's a social reason. It's out of politeness. It's because it's useful to me. You give me good information. If I pretend you really have, if I'm wrong in pretending you really have experiences, it still benefits me because I expand my experiences through you relaying your own and so on. And you might end up with no better reason to create this structure. But at least you would have a theory, and you could isolate applying that theory. If we could make a quantum computer that surprisingly behaved as something that reported a sense of self, again, it's not the genetic connection anymore, but we would understand, hey, here's the part of our common connection we think creates this. We put those parts together. If it creates that, we have leads and reasons to believe that it would all fit together. You can always be skeptical on those links, but we'll be a lot better off than we are now in our knowledge, right? So I don't believe in the questions that look unanswerable should not stop us now, because I believe there will always be unanswerable questions, but often the questions we think will be the unanswerable ones get answered, and they just yield even more interesting unanswerable questions. So I don't let those daunt our investigation, just as we don't let the fact that maybe it's not a mainstream investigation make us think that it's some kooky thing. Well, no, it's out there in theory. It's the kind of stuff that may or may not last, but it is real science, and this is an interesting part of science, is groups that are a little bit out ahead. And sometimes they're out ahead on a path that goes nowhere, but sometimes, they're on paths that go somewhere. And we know that because that's how science got somewhere. There's always somebody that has ended up on a path that went somewhere. And so I think we're at the trailhead of asking this first person problem while we work away feverishly for all kinds of practical as well as scientific reasons on solving the third person. Let's make robots that act like they have a sense of self. Let's go ahead, and we're actually much further along in that kind of pursuit than we are explaining the subjective interpretation of those experiences. And given you can look at the world mechanistically and say, well, this is what's really going on, this third person view of self, but somehow it creates this illusion, I'm fine if it turns out like that, and let's figure out how that illusion is generated. So and that's kind of what I think. I'm a materialist. I think that you could probably create sentient creatures that are sentient just like us, that would be robots, but maybe they need a special physical device, some sort of circuit, or like a new kind of integrated circuit, or maybe an old kind with the wires done correctly. I do believe that that's possible. The reason I doubt that we're going to do it with computers as we understand them now is just because the limits of Turing machines, which computers are, and what we know, so many things about computational models, I think we've subtracted out some of how the real world works with how chemistry works. Our computational models, chemistry is not particularly computational. You can make a simulation, but it really is a simulation. You have to deal with a lot of things. It's just like, in a computer you can't make a random number. Well, according to chemistry, it is possible to make a random number generator. Right? You could have a radioactive material and have a Geiger counting system hooked to it and get supposedly a legitimate random number, whereas in computational theory we would say no, that would never be random, it's always from the input. So, okay, cheers.